times we don't understand the law. Law for the People with Eric Cedillo is here to inform, educate, and answer your legal questions. Thank you for tuning in today. From the law offices of Eric Cedillo, located at 1725 Greenville Avenue in Dallas, Texas, here's your host, Eric Cedillo.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Law for the People with your host, me, Eric Cedillo. We come to you, of course, every Friday from 1 to 3. Please tune in from 1 to 3 during those times. The disclaimer that we always have on Law for the People, of course, is that we are kind of coming to you from the state of Texas, and we know we have listeners from all over the world, right, Fern?
Yes, sir.
So when we do mention something with respect to laws and other things, it's usually with respect to the state of Texas, and then we'll talk about federal laws and other things. But just kind of take that into consideration. I am very excited today to introduce my first guest this afternoon. Her name is Suzanne Smith, and she is running for school board, District 2, which is my district.
Yeah.
So I have a truly vested interest in what's happening. I've got two kiddos. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah.
I've got two kiddos who graduated from, we're going to go over some of the high schools here in your district, but I've got one that graduated from TAG, which was outside the district, but one that went to Woodrow Wilson High School, and of course the feeder patterns, J.L. Long and Stonewall, and I've got two that are currently, one is at Lakewood and one is at Long, so incredibly vested and looking forward to speaking with my first guest today. So without further ado, why don't I allow you to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up probably like a lot of young people that when I thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I felt like I could do anything that I wanted to accomplish. And I was fortunate enough that I had parents who also instilled that in me. They were public educators and started out as teachers and then eventually moved into administration. And I had great teachers that taught me that I could be anything I want to be. And so when I think about that and I think about where DISD is, part of what concerns me about DISD is we have some kids now who don't believe that anymore.
Yeah.
This American dream that we have talked about for so long, there are a lot of kids that don't believe in that anymore.
Right.
They aren't looking out at the stars and saying, I can do whatever I want. They're limited by the opportunities that are in front of them. And it's created what we've called, even beyond an achievement gap, an opportunity gap. We have some kids who have lots of opportunities, can go to whatever they want to do, be whatever they want to be, and we have a lot of kids that are held back by what we call concentrated poverty. So in their communities, they don't see the kind of things that your children saw or that I saw. And so that's really what I've committed my whole life to, is really trying to make a difference in the lives of those children. I've spent the better part of the past 2 decades working with at-risk youth for Phoenix House, then later went to the American Heart Association and worked with kids to make sure they had a healthy environment. I was really struck when I was at the Heart Association when one of our statisticians said to me, this will be the first generation that doesn't outlive their parents. Again, access to the American dream, is not just about academics, it's also about health and social and emotional development. And so that has been something that is instilled in me by my parents, and also because I had all the opportunities in the world to be what I wanted. And now this election really gives me an opportunity to bring that to the DISD board and think about how we can do more for the children that are in front of us.
Wonderful. Let's we're going to talk a little bit more at length, I think, Suzanne, about why you're running, why you're getting into this particular race. Before we do that, why don't we just talk about you for a little bit?
Yeah.
Let's give our listeners a sense of who you are. Were you born here in Dallas?
I actually was born in Rockwall, so east of Dallas, before it became a suburb of Dallas, interestingly enough. It was a small town. We were excited when the McDonald's and the Walmart went in.
Oh, really?
And now it has a Costco and a Bed Bath & Beyond and is really a suburb of Dallas. But it was a small town when I grew up there.
Okay. And went to schools there in Rockwall?
Went to Rockwall, and then eventually my sophomore year transferred to the Texas Academy of Math and Science, which was a magnet school that was on the campus of the University of North Texas. So I'm proud to go there. It was basically a dual credit program between your freshman and sophomore year of college and your junior and senior year of high school. So you do those concurrently.
Okay. Brothers and sisters?
So I have 3 sisters. So I'm the third. So I've got 2 older sisters, one that lives in Dallas and the other that lives in Seattle. Seattle, and then I've got a younger sister that's in San Antonio.
Okay.
And our family business is really teaching. So I grew up around teachers, my aunt and uncles, my brother-in-law is a teacher, and so that's really our family business. So at the dinner table, we would talk about what was going on in their classrooms.
Right. How much older brothers and sisters?
So I have my older sisters. My parents kind of had an older set, and then they
Okay.
had a younger set.
Yeah.
So much like what you guys had.
That's right.
And it was a fascinating because in some ways I felt like I almost had multiple mothers. You
Okay.
know, my oldest sister was 13 years old when I was born.
Right.
And so it kind of meant that I had special attention from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned that before. I've got the gap is about 13 years between my my second and my third. So I understand how that is.
Exactly.
Okay, so you kind of grew up as what? You're kind of the oldest one in your group?
I was. And actually, the other thing that's interesting about my family is we're a very patriotic family. And so
Uh-huh.
I was a bicentennial baby. So
Oh,
I was
wow.
born in 1976.
I remember it well, yeah.
My grandmother did what a typical Texas grandmother does and made me a bicentennial quilt and then put it into the State Fair of Texas, and it got first place.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And so she was very excited about having a patriotic baby. And so my dad and mom both were very involved in local politics. My dad eventually ran for Rockwall County Commissioner.
Okay.
And we were very involved in making a difference in our community, whether it was at the schools or it was outside of the schools.
Okay. And the quilt? What happened to the quilt?
The quilt is actually still in my I put it in my dining room, actually.
right?
So I have it displayed in my dining room with the ribbon.
Ah, that's nice.
Uh-huh.
Your folks, you mentioned they were educators. What did
Yeah.
they do? How long were they
Yeah,
teaching?
so like I said, it was kind of a family business. And so
Okay.
my aunts and uncles that were older than my dad had been in teaching. And so when he decided to go to school, he decided to become a teacher. He actually was in DISD for 22 years.
Oh, wow.
He started out his teaching career at SS Connor.
Okay.
And actually prior to that was also at Reinhardt.
Okay.
And so was in fact, I still meet people to this day who had my dad as a teacher.
Is that right?
And so when they find out, particularly through this election, I've had a number of his former students contact me excited that his daughter is actually running for office.
Uh-huh.
And so he was a great, he was a coach, and that was really, when he looked back on his childhood, those are the people who made a difference for him and encouraged him as he went through. And so he was a football coach, he was a health teacher, and worked for DISD for 22 years before he moved out and was a middle school principal in Royce City.
Okay. Did he do anything before that? Was he always a teacher?
He's always been a teacher,
Okay.
and that was always the thing he loved the most, is really working with kids, letting them know that they could do whatever they wanted to do. So he was kind of paying it forward because he had many teachers and coaches that did that for him. His father died when he was relatively young,
Uh-huh.
and so he had lots of great mentors that helped him as he was growing up.
Where was he from? Where did he
He actually grew up in East Texas.
East Texas, okay.
In Omaha, Texas. And so he grew up in a very small town and, is definitely a small town guy.
Right. How about your mom?
So my mom actually grew up in Utah, and they actually met in Utah. It's kind of a neat story. My dad, when he was a teacher, what they did oftentimes in the summer is they'd be park rangers. So teachers would, over the summer, since they didn't work,
Right.
they would get a congressional appointment to be a park ranger. So he got congressionally appointed to Dinosaur National Monument, and they tell the story that my dad was walking down, of course, in his very nice park ranger outfit. My mom was selling postcards in
He was in the uniform. Yeah,
it's the
okay.
uniform.
Yeah.
He was selling. My mom was selling postcards in the gift shop, and the rest is history.
Okay.
And so she came to Texas, finished up her college degree at East Texas State University, which is now A&M Commerce. They had my sister, and continued in teaching. And she actually was a teacher for a number of years. Worked in elementary school, then she worked in a high school, and then she eventually was an elementary principal and then assistant superintendent.
Okay. So educators, your folks, did they ever encourage you to become a teacher? Had you ever thought about that?
Yeah,
possibility?
I actually thought about it. I was always interested in the nonprofit space and interested in making a difference in that way. I actually do actually teach a class at University of North Texas as an
Okay.
adjunct, so that's how I get my teaching in. But I love getting in front of an audience. I do a lot of workshops and seminars in the role that I'm in, and that's one of my favorite aspects of what I do. So I see that as a form of teaching, and then I love getting in front of the 50 students I do every Monday night at UNT. It's one of my favorite parts of the week.
Okay. You talked a little bit about on why you were running for trustee.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just give our listeners kind of an idea of what your sense of what a trustee does here
Yeah.
at DISD. What is that?
So a trustee, and this is true, I think, mostly across the nation, it's a little bit different state to state. But generally speaking, the trustee, and the reason why we call it a trustee is because they're supposed to be representing the interest of the children.
Right.
They're entrusted with that representative kind of thinking about the children. So the first thing that they really are supposed to do is set policy. And that's a very important part because it's different than managing the school district. And so that's one of the big tightropes you have to walk between policy governance and management, and making sure that you kind of leave management to the next one, which is essentially you hire the superintendent. So you are the overseer of that particular person, but only that person. We also have oversight over the auditor as well. So there's two employees that we actually hire and fire. And so that gives you a sense of what the policy is. And then also the last part is the budget, how the budget is supposed to be allocated. And that is obviously very connected to what your priorities are. So those are the three main responsibilities of a trustee. I also tell people there's another part that I think is important, much like a congressional representative has their individual districts. We also have a district. So District 2 is essentially a donut around Highland Park, which is in the major kind of middle area of Dallas. Mm-hmm. And so we have Preston Hollow, M Streets, Lakewood, Oak Lawn, Bluffview, and Love Field. It's a very diverse district, lots of different things going on. And so part of our job is to kind of do constituent relations, much like a congressional rep would do. So if there's a problem in a particular school, we try to provide as much help as possible. And we have kind of a very vested interest in the specific schools in our feeder patterns, but also the specific schools in our district.
I've had an opportunity to talk with a number of candidates running for trustee.
Yep.
I've talked to a number of course, trustees in DISD. And you're absolutely right. I think the majority of them understand what a trustee is all about, what basically the creation of policy and other things. One of the big things for me, in looking, I think one of the biggest responsibilities of a trustee is when they do hire and support a superintendent. And recently, we had a superintendent who was somewhat polarizing.
Right.
It's someone who you either loved him or hated him, or I'm not sure how many people actually loved him, but I liked him. I liked kind of what he brought initially, and having conversations with him over a period of time. I think more than anything else, he was kind of adhering to what he had been brought in for. I mean, that's the reality of it.
Right.
And one of those things was to kind of create some change.
Right.
And I think he did that. And I think the big reason why he didn't stay, from my perspective, was that he didn't know how to kind of transition into something else. He lost a lot of support from, of course, teachers and some of the administration. So we now have Hinojosa,
Right.
who was a trustee before Mike Miles. I'm, of course, talking about Mike Miles. And then before that, we had Hinojosa was a superintendent for a period of time. Now we brought him back. Any thoughts and ideas about what Mike Miles did? Some of the programs are still in place.
Right. Well, I think before we even get into that, I think let's talk a little bit about, I think, one of the things that has been challenging for the district, particularly under Mike Miles' administration. I think one of the things we have a tough time with is change management. I mean, it's a very large city. Lots of different constituency groups. It's a large district with lots of constituency groups and stakeholders. You've got parents, you've got students, you've got teachers. You have a lot of different people, taxpayers, who have a vested interest in the school district being successful. And one of the things that I felt like Mike Miles did a great job of is that he understood the face of education and what needed to happen in order to turn around the district specifically. For your listeners, I mean, we have 85% of our individual students who are in poverty. Many of those are in extreme poverty. And so one of the things my dad would tell me as a child is in order to reach a kid, in order to teach a kid, you had to reach a kid. Okay. And so we had to figure out how to reach them in a very specific way. And so he was doing some things that I think were really allowing us to turn around schools. So the policies that he was doing, by and large, were good policies. But what it didn't happen is there wasn't a change management philosophy of how do you do that, not from the top down, which I think that is not always the best way to do it, but from a bottom-up perspective. How do you get the stakeholders involved in that conversation? How do you get them involved in the change? I think Hinojosa, on the other hand, to juxtapose Miles with Hinojosa, I think he gets change management. In fact, most people don't realize this, but he was actually a government teacher before he actually got into administration. So he actually very much understands the nature of democracy and consensus building. So he's been able to come in, I think, smooth some things out, continue some of the reforms that Mike Miles started that were very important for the district, and then allowed people to really voice their opinion guidance about those things. And we're slowly but surely tweaking things a little bit here and there to make sure that they fit Dallas. You know, Dallas is a unique place, and we need to make sure that the reforms that were put into place fit the environment that we're in.
I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, Suzanne, but I kind of wanted to get into it a little bit. Your kind of your philosophy, some of the things that you've talked about, kind of introducing as a trustee, some things that I found really interesting, fascinating, quite honestly, with respect to treating the whole child.
Right.
I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree that the DISD may not look like other districts. I believe 70% of the district are Latino. About 19 to 20% are African American.
Absolutely.
So we're looking at a situation, you couple that culturally, things that you need to take into consideration, but also the fact, as you mentioned, 85 to 90% are in that poverty range. We're dealing with a situation where we've got lots of students who maybe come in initially speaking Spanish as their primary language. And that is something of a hurdle. You talk about pre-K and some of the materials that you have. Tell us about the importance of pre-K in terms of specifically the demographic of DISD.
So this has actually been an area that I've spent quite a bit of time studying. Dallas has been a little bit slower than other urban areas to really adopt pre-K as being one of the major game changers. As many people know, we want as many kids coming to kindergarten as ready as possible. They're ready to actually work with their teachers. They have some sense of their shapes and colors. They also have some sense of reading and at beginning stages of reading. We do have programs like Head Start and Early Head Start that help us with that. So you can go into environments and make sure that people who need additional assistance are getting that assistance. But we still had many families where the students were coming the first day of kindergarten, they just weren't ready. And that's very difficult for teachers to be able to overcome that hurdle within one year. So we realized that even though in the same way we brought kindergarten into school system, remember that it used to be that you didn't go to kindergarten. We also are looking and saying, pre-K needs to be mandatory. We need to make sure all kids have that early access to a great education, a quality education. The other thing that's coupled with that is we have now a lot of brain research, and that's one of my hobbies, is actually studying brain research and all the ways in which our brain works for us and works against us. Right. And most of the development of brain happens between 0 to 5. And so if we can get that really rich, interactive, quality experience for young people, then they're going to be ready when they get to kindergarten, which is really what we need. So the district has taken steps to put together a fantastic plan along with the community. We actually have a public-private partnership called Early Matters. I was in some of the previous things that predated that around where the community was. We also have a number of different providers here locally, Educational First Steps and Child Care Group, who I've worked with, who work with private providers to make sure the quality education is there. And so I think we are at a precipice of bringing pre-K into alignment and making sure that anybody who wants to have access to it can have access to quality pre-K. And it's really just a matter of funding it. So that's really what we're looking at right now, is funding it in the way that we can to make sure everybody has access to it.
What do we currently have in terms of a pre-K program in DISD?
So right now it's limited to certain low-income thresholds, which is obviously not the ideal, because you do want, there's a lot of research that says you want mixed classrooms as much as possible. So you have peer groups that come from are very diverse and comes from different economic stratas. We don't have that yet. There's a lot of parents who've said to me, look, I'll pay to go to pre-K and DISD if I need to. So that's one of the things I would be very supportive of, is us trying to figure out how we can get mandatory universal pre-K so that if anybody wants to come to DISD pre-K, that they can. And I know that's something DISD is working on right now.
We talk about universal pre-K. Of course, that would mean that everyone who fell within that age group would have the ability to go to pre-K. You mentioned earlier that the development before 5. I remember I didn't go to kindergarten. My mother sent us to a Catholic school, and I literally first day of first grade, I walked in, and we had a nun who sat us all up in the front row, and we would stick our hands out and we would read from a chart. And if you got it wrong, she would hit you with a ruler. And
Wow.
that was just the way that was. She was about 90 years old.
Of course.
And this was the early 70s, so they certainly could get away with it back then. But I remember not being able to read.
Yeah.
And I would have to look at the pictures, and hopefully there'd be a picture so I
Yeah.
could kind of mouth what it was. And I remember thinking that, gosh, I don't belong here. You know, all
Exactly.
these kids already know what's going on, and I'm going to fall behind. And I did for the first couple of years. And luckily, I was able to catch up. Second, third grade, I could just imagine how much more difficult that would have been if Spanish was my first language.
Right.
And if I had additional difficulty in following up.
Absolutely.
Currently, our pre-K program is, like you said, there's limitations with respect to who can apply for
Right.
it. And in addition to that, there's been a back and forth with respect to the age grouping.
Right.
I know this applies to 4-year-olds.
4-year-olds.
Some are talking about 3-year-olds.
3-year-olds. Mhm.
How do you feel about that? How does that kind of play into a universal pre-K program?
Well, so when you think about pre-K and us getting our the best outcomes, you want to look at a number of different things. You want to look at demand, you want to look at access, and you want to look at quality.
Okay.
So right now, we're trying to improve quality of all the seats that we have. So even DISD is working on improving the quality of pre-K within their existing classrooms, and you have a lot of efforts by Educational First Steps and Child Care Group to make sure that the quality is there, because we're learning new things about how children do better when they're actually in pre-K. The other is access. So we have some, pre-K deserts, for lack
Yeah.
of a better word, in this
Yeah.
community where it's hard to get quality pre-K in certain areas. And so that's one of the things we need to look at, is where our changing population demographics are, and making sure that the schools that are in that area have pre-K. Then you have to look at demand. Right now, 40% of Hispanic families send their kids to pre-K versus 50% African American and 60% Caucasian. So it's also getting that the communities collectively to believe that it's okay to send your baby to
Right.
to pre-K or the elementary school. The other thing that's underpinning some of the big changes within DISD is it's been a K through 12 system for a long time. So if you go to an elementary school, they don't even have the facilities for a small child, particularly a 3-year-old.
Yes.
They don't have the buses, they don't have the the transportation, or all of the different even tables, restroom facilities that a 3 or 4-year-old would need. And so we have to really think about how we're going to reimagine what elementary school looks like. So for example, San Antonio chose to actually have one big building that was all pre-K, rather than putting it in different elementary schools. And that may be something we decide we want to do at some point, depending on resources. But that's what a lot of school districts have done, is still isolate pre-K in one particular building, just so you can scale up pre-K as quickly as possible and get as many kids in pre-K as wants to be in pre-K.
That actually makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that the current school district, or I don't know if they voted last night or made a determination on whether or not they were going to move into the big building.
They are, yeah.
So, that may be a consideration.
Yeah.
Suzanne, I want to definitely get back into this. We're going to take a break in about 4 minutes.
Okay.
But before we do that, you'd been talking about what you'd been working on and what you'd been doing and working with nonprofits.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit more about that in terms of what is it you do?
Sure.
Of course, a trustee is someone who comes in and basically volunteers their time. They don't get paid.
Right.
It's a situation where you guys, I really feel that trustees should be paid, and the amount of work that they do and the commitment they have
Right.
to make. But that aside, they've got to have, they got to have a job.
Right.
So let's talk about you. What is it you do, and how have you had that opportunity to kind of see the inner workings of some of these programs?
Absolutely. Well, I'm really lucky that I get to do the job that is about my passion, and my passion is making a difference in the community, mostly for children. So I started a company 7 years ago after I got my MBA at Duke, after working in the nonprofit space. And one of the reasons why I started it is because I felt like when I was in the nonprofit space, it was very difficult to get good people to help me with strategy. And there was this void, and in particular here in Dallas. And when I went to get my MBA at Duke, there were so many things there that they taught me about how to transfer business practices to the nonprofit space. And while we have really great people in the nonprofit space who have heart, they sometimes don't have access to these same practices.
Right.
They want to have access to them. Most of my training classes and workshops, sell out because they want to get access to this information, but it's just not readily taught in their graduate level programs.
Okay.
So you have a number of really passionate CEOs and staff members who recognize that the scale at which the problems that we have in Dallas, and I work across the country, so Cincinnati or Seattle, you can take whichever community you're in, are much larger than their individual nonprofit can deal with. And so what they want to do is try to figure out how they can move beyond just incremental results to exponential results.
Okay.
How they can really move the needle on their particular issues. So the company is really about how do we do that, and we do it in 3 different ways. We start first with consulting, and so we work on strategic plans with nonprofits, helping them to get breakthrough results within their own organization. We also coach them as well, so as they continue to move forward, helping them with any kind of roadblocks they come across. We also want to provide as much of the intellectual property that we have free of charge, much like you do. So we have what we call kind of a DIY model, a do-it-yourself model. So we do workshops and trainings. In fact, last week I was in Cincinnati. I did a session on storytelling, and then I just did a session on business plans, helping them do business plans themselves. And then we also do a lot of writing. So I have a blog that is out every Thursday called Social Trend Spotter. We look at the trends in the space and really try to relay those trends. Because some of the things that happens and what holds us back as a community is we're so siloed. So the education folks only talk to the education folks, the people in human services only talk to them, the healthcare folks only talk to the healthcare folks. Right. But the nature at which our problems exist are across those disciplines. When you're seeing that family who's a single mom with kids, she doesn't see silos. She just knows that she's got to go to 4 different agencies to get her needs met, which makes it virtually impossible to get all the needs met for her children. And so part of what I try to do is with that particular person, that client in mind, how do we create a system in Dallas that makes it easier for people to access the opportunities where they can get themselves out of poverty? They can help their kids reach for their dreams. And that the vehicle for that is the nonprofits or the foundations in the community. Okay.
I think that's a very nice little segue for our second spot that I want to talk to you a little bit about in terms of the relationships between some of the municipalities, some of the other governmental agencies that kind of come together within a city to kind of represent the citizenry and what the responsibilities of a DISD trustee might be. But we're going to take a quick break for about 2 minutes. We'd ask that you guys please rejoin us, and we'll have more with our special guest, Ms. Suzanne Smith. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Come back.
Many times we don't understand the law. Law for the People with Eric Cedillo is here to inform, educate, and answer your legal questions. Thank you for tuning in today. From the law offices of Eric Cedillo, located at 1725 Greenville Avenue in Dallas, Texas. Here's your host, Eric Cedillo.
Fern, I think we should have played more of the Prince and less of the advertisement we just had. I'm sure people are.
You can never go wrong with Prince.
We didn't let it finish.
Hey, it's Friday. It's the weekend.
I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you. We're here reminiscing about Prince a little while ago. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for rejoining us. Again, we're here with Suzanne Smith, who's running for DISD School Board as a trustee in District 2. Suzanne, before we went into break, we were talking a little bit about the responsibilities of a trustee in DISD. There is one program in particular that for me, a few years back, I had seen an HBO special, and I saw it was 2 African-American brothers. It was, of course, a documentary, and they were probably like 10 and 7, and they went on to school, and they were getting into a fight in the hallway, African-American, and the teacher was kind of trying to separate them, and the younger one was inconsolable, just crying and going nuts, and the teacher kind of pulled him apart, and he wouldn't stop fighting with his older brother, and finally she got him away, and they were talking to him, and she said, are you hungry? Do you want something? And it turns out the kid hadn't had breakfast, hadn't had dinner, hadn't eaten really since lunch the day before, and if you tell me that doesn't affect what it is they're thinking and what the performance is, I bring that up because we have a program here in DISD, which I think again is very good. The breakfast in class program, which allows for I believe it's limited currently to preschool. Elementary and junior high programs, and I think they're implementing it with the high school soon. But if you don't have that basic stuff,
it's true.
Then you're going to have some real issue with the child's performance, their ability to take tests, their ability to listen and learn, things of that nature. So that kind of touches upon your holistic approach in terms of the child. Let's talk a little bit about that, and if we could, this particular program, what I've heard from a lot of the teachers is it can be kind of wasteful. You know, we have a mandate that says that we aren't really allowed to, you know, regardless of whether or not the food was touched, it gets thrown away. And seems very wasteful to me. But not only that, we've got other issues with, you know, the homeless. We've got people that we could truly benefit from that.
Right.
But, you know, there's that law that kind of keeps you from doing that. How do we, you know, I know it's not the responsibility of a trustee or someone coming in as a trustee to take care of the entire community, but maybe we should. Maybe the citizenry should be taking those things into consideration. Kind of discuss that holistic approach that you have going on.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why I put in the action plan connected community.
Okay.
Because I do think that for too long we have said that the purpose of education is DISD's responsibility. And then we have the other elected officials. We've got the county and we've got the city who really have left it to DISD. So my platform is really about it takes all of us. We've got kids significant disadvantages. You know, you mentioned one, which is them coming to school hungry, but we also have a number of our student population is homeless. And 24% of our homeless population actually are children, and that doesn't even count those who are couch surfing. We also have a number of children who come to school and they feel unsafe. They feel like they're being bullied. So there's countless issues that they're dealing with before they even can get into a classroom and actually be taught. And so because of that, I feel like we have to come together as a community. And so that's one of the reasons why my relevant experience on various boards and commissions with the city, the work that I've done with the county when I was working with Phoenix House, and all of those are directly applicable. Because if we're going to educate these children, there's a whole lot of other barriers that come into play before they can even be educated, which is what you're referencing. I'm reminded of a story, and it was actually right as I was trying to decide if I was going to run or not, you know, because this wasn't in my plan for 2016. This is a special election. So when I found out that Mike Morath was moving on to be TEA commissioner, was excited for him and had a number of people call me and say, hey, you should consider this. And so as I was carefully considering it and talking to friends and family, I got an opportunity to tour Roosevelt High School.
Okay.
Such a great high school, great legacy. And I walk into the high school and I can see committed teachers and students who are energized. And then I saw, you know, they've got a really great program there called Cedillo, that they have these young people who are trying to work with the kids. So I was excited about Roosevelt, but then when I heard their statistics, they start out with a freshman class of 200, but they graduate 60 of those 200, and only one is college ready.
Wow.
And, you know, I asked them some just basic questions around, you know, how many of these, of the 59 go to Dallas County Community College District? Couldn't get really great answers to that. So although I'm very excited recently that there's been some news that we're going to start doing more early college high schools, and there's been more deals made with Dallas County Community College District. But it's really our responsibility not to just give that child a diploma and say we're done with that child. You know, now they move on to the other systems, but to figure out how we can vertegrate all of our systems.
Right.
And make sure that we're paying attention to all the needs of our children. One of the other examples that I'm excited about is North Dallas High School has one of the most significant proportions of homeless individuals, homeless children. And you know, again, they may not be specifically on the streets, but they are in an unstable environment. So the Church of the Incarnation right across the street started Incarnation House very recently. And it's a place for the kids, as soon as they get done with their high school studies and their extracurricular activities, they can walk across the street, they can get a hot meal. There are mentors there who want to talk to them about what happened at school, can advise them. There's computer labs for them to get their homework done. There's complete wraparound services. In addition to that, they also consider the family members part of that family. So if for whatever reason the mother or father has lost their job, they help that mother or father get a job. Really trying to make sure that their role is to create stability in the lives of that child so they can have what I call a successful finish. And to me, that's the kind of stuff we need to be paying attention to. It's not completely the responsibility of DISD, but how do we as a community collectively wrap our services around what DISD is doing to help all those kids be successful?
What do you know of what DISD has in place with respect to homeless children? There's no doubt that I believe North Dallas High School has the highest incident of child homelessness or student homelessness, but throughout the district, I would imagine there'd be hundreds more. Do you know what type of programs DISD has in place to kind of assist those kids in need?
So so there's a couple of things. They do have a couple of people at the administrative office who really work on that specific population.
Okay.
But you can imagine, out of all the various schools, it's difficult. One, it's hard to even identify homeless individuals because oftentimes, like I said, they're couch surfing, or they have run away and they're staying with a friend.
Yeah.
So that's really one of the difficult parts, is really identifying it, because a lot of the kids don't want to be found out, because then they may get put in the foster care system and they may create greater instability.
Yeah.
There's always that fear factor. But then essentially what they try to do is, one, make sure that they have services, and then two, they connect with Promise House, which is one of our leading providers of sheltering, which is a very great program in South Dallas, where most of the homeless youth or runaway youth go to, so that they can finish their degrees, and so they can get kind of that real connection to adults and mentors, and have a stable environment to be in.
Yeah, you talk about couch surfing. I had wonderful parents, and we had a few couch surfers for a period of time during my high school years, so I can certainly appreciate that. Very difficult circumstances and situations, and without, quite honestly, for these individuals that I'm thinking of, without my folks, I'm not sure what they would have been able to do.
Right.
So it's good to hear. Would you do anything as a trustee to kind of look into that a little bit deeper, in terms of, are we dedicating enough of our resources to those things? So
I personally don't think we are. I think we have lots of resources in the community that want to come into DISD and work with them. I think we have lots of kids who have all sorts of different issues. So now it's called toxic stress, where they have all sorts of trauma that they've been exposed to, whether it's their parents are in prison, or they have homelessness, or they have food insecurity. I mean, there's all sorts of different issues that they could be exposed to. And so because of that, we really need to have counseling staff, psychiatric staff. We need outside providers coming in. One of the things I'm very excited about is that DISD is looking at the model of community schools, which is a model that has been done in Cincinnati and Austin, where we do provide those wraparound services, and there are on-site counselors and specialists who can work with individuals, but they also are working with them in the community as well.
Yeah.
So you do create that wraparound group without necessarily making the school district responsible for it. Because keep in mind, school districts are made to really educate kids. That's what they're really great at. Right. We do have counselors and librarians. One of the things I'm concerned about is we've continued to reduce their role into really being just testing supervisors. So one of the things as a trustee, and also this could something we need to advocate for statewide, is we need to figure out how they can go back to being librarians and counselors. Librarians provide a really important role with the level of learning to their young people, and oftentimes, because of testing, they've been moved into this kind of alternate paperwork role. Same thing with counselors. We have a number of our students who are in special education, but those counselors are really our frontline workers to work with them to make sure accommodations are made around dyslexia, ADHD. Most people don't realize that if you're homeless, you're also considered special education. So one of the things I want to work on is really looking at how we're providing special ed services, because the key is, if you intervene early, you can actually reduce costs in the long run. If you can figure out what their issue is and what their learning difference is, you can actually get that remediation very, very quickly in first, second, and third grade, and then they can go through mainstreaming through the rest of their time to 12th grade and be very successful. Yeah. So we really have just, we talk about teachers a whole lot, but there's also these support staff members, counselors and special ed teachers and diagnosticians that we haven't done as much as we could to make sure that they're successful, so they can make sure our students are successful.
Suzanne, before we get to I really want to get into your kind of your successful finish, and talk about that, and we'll probably finish with that in a few. What I'd like to talk to you about some of the kind of the hot button issues with respect to what I think I've seen over the last couple of years with Miles when he was in there and implementing programs, TEI.
Right.
It's been relatively controversial, especially I think with teachers. Now for me, in all honesty, I think principals and teachers, they are of course, that lifeline, that connection between, the implementation of policy and actually getting it through to the students. Incredibly important to the process, incredibly important to the success of anything that we put in place. sometimes, not always, but sometimes that can be at odds with what our students need, in all honesty. And I think that was, the biggest issue, I think, with Mike Miles. Lots of teachers didn't like the way in which he was implementing the programs, and we kind of touched upon that a little bit. But what do you think about the current program in terms of the assessment of the way teachers are compensated? Why don't you discuss TEI a little bit with us and then give us your thoughts on it?
So TEI follows a number of best practices from the Gates Foundation and others who've really looked at how can you evaluate this idea of teaching. Teaching is both an art and a science.
Right.
Someone who teaches myself, you have to really have a little bit of both. You have a syllabus and you know what you're going to teach, but on the other hand, it really is dependent on how the students react to it and what their experiences are that they're bringing to the conversation. So there's an art and a science to it a little bit. And so TEI really looks at how can we make sure that all of our teachers are contributing to the success of children. So the first thing they look at is student surveys, and they start that not at kindergarten and first grade, but they start it later when kids can actually take surveys. This has been somewhat of a controversial element among parents because they are concerned that their children don't necessarily have the maturity to be able to grade teachers appropriately.
Right.
The good news is based on the research, it does seem as if that the student surveys mirror performance pretty closely. So I believe student surveys are a good part for us to include. The next is spot observations from the principals.
Right.
That's something my parents did. My dad would walk the halls and sit in classrooms. My mom would do the same thing. This is actually a more structured way of doing it. And obviously, anytime you're observing somebody, there's a point of where people may act slightly different, but you can still get a good sense of are they doing what they need to be doing, and are they being consistent with what they said they were going to do. The next is really looking at test scores and seeing how well the teacher has been doing as far as their baseline scores when they first come in and what level of progress they're getting relative to other teachers and how successful are they with their individual students. And so that's really what they look at, and essentially they're able to grade teachers based on each of those. They get a cumulative score, and then that cumulative score, if it reaches a certain amount, they can actually apply to get bonus structures through our Distinguished Teachers program.
What do you think about the weight given to those areas? Student surveys and other things, they're relatively lower in terms of the weighted scale.
They are.
Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think there would be some tweaking involved, or what do you think?
I think the weights right now, I'd have to go back and look at the data and see, people who we thought were good teachers, what factored into that. Generally speaking, I know just from my experience that all those things apply, and if you're a great teacher, those things aren't really going to matter because you're going to do well across the board.
Okay.
You're not going to do well in two and not in one.
Right.
And so I think that from my perspective, those are the right things. The only thing I may possibly add, and this is something that I think teachers maybe have a good point with, is that it's really led to more competition, and it's competition related to distinguished teachers. So instead of having everybody being a great teacher, they're really isolating 2 or 3 people in an individual school, and that can create some competition among teachers. So could we do more around looking at across the board whether a school has been successful and putting that as part of the compensation? Could we add more 360 so other teachers have to evaluate other teachers as far as their level of cooperation, their level of giving back to the school overall? Do they, as soon as the bell rings, do they leave, or are they still very involved in extracurricular activities and mentoring students? So from my perspective, that would be the only other thing I might add is figuring out how we can bring back that collaborative environment to the weighting.
Okay. Your action plan, I wanted to get into this successful finish, so let's do that, and let's go ahead and finish up with it. Explain it to us.
So part of the goal of the action plan was for me to spend time with parents and teachers and all the various stakeholders and get their input first. To me as an elected official, as a public servant, you have to know what your constituents want. So I didn't want to put out a platform on day 1. I wanted to wait. So I waited on day 75. And this pre-K part was incredibly important to folks and making sure we had that strong start, which is inclusive of making sure parents know that they're very involved. Whole child, which we talked about. Right. I think people really do want to move to a place where we're talking about not just the education, but all the different things that make a child successful. Then we also talked about empowered schools, which gets to the teachers and the facilities. Connected community, which talks about, how do we kind of create those wraparounds so that all students can be successful. Right. And then really getting to the perception of DISD. We haven't talked as much about that, but much like many other urban school districts, the perception of of DISD is that there's constantly bad stuff going on. If you follow the paper, that's the easy part to write about.
Right.
But the truth is there's lots of good that are happening in many of our schools. So it's how do we change that dynamic of really talking about the good stuff. The last part is successful finish, and this is something that I think needs to shift, and goes back to the conversation we had about Roosevelt High School. How do we make sure every child it's more than just a graduation diploma? Because we're losing a lot of kids dropping out even before they get their diploma. So clearly they don't see a value proposition for them, not only to get the diploma, but then after the diploma, how do we create that value proposition? So it gets to us moving to beyond just the piece of paper and saying, once they walk across the stage, what are they walking toward? They're walking towards a successful finish, which means being enrolled in a 2 or 4 year college and having the financial aid to attend. So focusing on, Dallas County Community College District as an example and all the various things that they can provide. The next is being enlisted in the military and making sure they have that as an option. And then the last is being employed in a living wage job. And doing something what we're calling career pathways, identifying people, in their 9th or 10th grade year and saying, what do you want to be? And it could be that, they want to be a great plumber, or they want to be a good computer technician, or they want to be a paramedic. Right. We have a shortage in a lot of different areas. They may want to be a teacher. So how do we create a career pathway in high school so that they can start moving towards that profession? So instead of just the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, they're learning it through the lens of that profession, whether they're going to go on to college or they're going to go on and get a certificate. So DISD has made some strides in this area around career tech. They're also looking at early college, high schools. So to me, that is a successful finish. I want every child, when they graduate and get that piece of paper, to know exactly what their next step is and make sure that we as a community have equipped them for that next step.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Suzanne, the election itself.
Yeah.
You're actually running to fill the last year, is
yes.
it, of the former trustee's term, and then there'll be an additional election after that.
Right.
Tell us when the actual election date is. I think we're currently in early voting.
You're currently in early voting right now. It'll be going on until May 3rd, and then the actual election day is May 7th. So we're on the ballot with that, as well as Dallas County Community College District.
Oh, wonderful. Any parting words for our listeners?
I think the main thing I would say is just go out and vote. We haven't had an election in this particular district since 2002. And one of the things that I've loved about this election is it's animated a lot of people around what are the possibilities for DISD. So I've talked to even private school parents who are excited about this election because it is really about the future of Dallas. 70% of our kids go to DISD. So goes those students, so goes Dallas.
Absolutely.
So they're excited about this opportunity to really cast their ballot and think about the future in a positive way for Dallas and DISD.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on and telling us about you and telling us about what you have in store for DISD. Really appreciate it. Once again, this is Law for the People. We are going to be taking a short break and coming back with our second guest of the afternoon, Ms. Monica Lira. Once again, Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And good luck with your election.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
The law offices of Eric Cedillo, a professional corporation, a firm that handles legal matters in personal injury, auto and truck accidents, wrongful death, on-the-job injuries, criminal, felony, and misdemeanor, family law, divorce, and child custody. The law offices of Eric Cedillo, located at 1725 Greenville Avenue in Dallas, at 214-740-1628. That's 214-740-1628. Find them on the web at CedilloLaw.com. That's CedilloLaw.com.